Hey guys, so about 2 years ago, following Survivor 44, I made a series of videos talking about the new era more in general, and now that it's been 2 more years and we've had 4 more seasons, I figured now is as good a time as ever to update those lists, so that's what I'll be doing here. And the first of these videos I want to update is my top 10 worst players of the new era video, which I had a lot of fun making at the time I originally made it. And as a heads up for this video up ahead, the list ends up being quite a bit different from what my original list looked like, not only after accounting for players who have played since 44, but even within the players who were on the original list, where I did quite a bit of shuffling around and reassessment over what I consider to be good gameplay and bad gameplay, to where this list ends up being quite a bit different from the original list, which is pretty fun there. But before we get into the list, we're going to go through some honorable mentions here. So first up, I want to talk about the people who are on the original top 10 worst players list who have been kicked off the list. And as a spoiler alert, 6 of the people who were on the original list are no longer on the list, which is pretty interesting there. And first up, we do have Mariah Young from Survivor 43, who was barely on the original list. She was number 10. And I feel like she was always going to be kicked off as more people were added on. And that's pretty much the result here. I never really saw Mariah as being that terrible of a player in the grand scheme of things. While she's not particularly good, and I feel like she's someone who I would expect to be an early boot more often than not, I still feel like she did enough good on her run where she at least tried to align with the likes of Sammy and was trying to get this women's alliance to sit together, even though it wasn't, to where it was enough to keep her off this list here. Next up, we have Mariah from Survivor 42, who again was pretty low here. She was number 8 on the original list, and is another player who I don't think is that bad in the grand scheme of things. And you can even say that she got a bit unlucky, where she was at least considered to be like this long-term option to keep around from the Taku 4. And even then was also unlucky by Jackson being pulled from the game. So I do feel like there were enough redeeming qualities to keep Mariah off the list, even though she was barely on the original list to begin with. Next up, we have Justine from Survivor 43, who again was also on the lower side of things at number 7, and is another person who I don't consider to be that terrible of a player in the grand scheme of things. And she was probably going to be kicked off regardless, though I think my assessment of her has gone up a little bit over time as well, to where she at least could have caused a tie on the first tribal that she attended, which is enough there to keep her off the list. Next up, we have Lindsay from Survivor 43, and I think this one was a bit more debatable, as you can say that she did more wrong to cause her own boot, with her getting really paranoid during her boot round, where she was pretty safe up until she started acting up. And obviously she was at least more of a consideration for remaining on the list compared to the people you already talked about. But as I talked about in the original video, I still think she has some potential in the game, and I think she largely just got spooked by actually being on the island and having that experience being different from what you see on the TV show, to where I feel like if she were to come back and had a bit more time to calm down, that she probably would have had some potential in the game. And I do think she still has some skills for the game. I just think what we saw from her was more likely to be a one-time thing than anything else, though it was enough to keep her off the list here. Next up, we have Ryan from Survivor 43, and I actually did consider keeping Ryan on the list initially, as I still think Ryan is a pretty bad player. I still think he did a lot of things wrong across this season, like him throwing the challenge, thinking he was going to get a 1-up here, only to get blindsided the Geo vote. And even beyond that, like I still think he's someone who probably would have been a losing finalist had he gotten towards the end of the game. But I still think Ryan is someone who at least made it far enough into the game. He survived enough tribals, and even in his boot round, it got pretty unlucky that James was the one voted out at the other tribal. So I think those things were enough, mixing in the fact that he at least got to the final 8. Those things were enough to keep him off the list, even though he was still like kind of high on my original list. But I think after reassessing my criteria for this list, it wasn't enough to kick him off. But I still think he's a pretty bad player for his placement. And the final person who was on my original list but is no longer on here is Jeannie. And it's kind of funny that Jeannie is no longer on the list, considering she was literally number 1 on my original list. I feel like Jeannie is a pretty bad player, someone who will probably never make a move. And while she does get to the final 2 of UA, she was pretty much on the bottom for a lot of it, where she was voting incorrectly at a lot of tribals. She had her outbursts here and there. And again, I feel like Jeannie's the one who, even if she admitted to merge, she probably would have been like a lackey for the likes of Ricard and Sham moving forward. And sort of similar to Ryan, I feel like she's probably a worse player than what her placement on the season indicates. But at the end of the day, she still survived several tribals. She at least got to the final 3 of her tribe, which was enough, I guess, to keep her off the list, even though she was number 1, which is funny in hindsight. But I think after like changing my criteria for this list and really thinking about what I think constitutes the worst player of the new era, I feel like Jeannie doesn't really fit that mold anymore. And considering the merits of her game. I feel like it was enough to keep her off here. Now let's talk about the players who have played since the original video, who I did consider for the list, but didn't ultimately make it. And first up, there were a lot of honorable mentions from 45 who didn't make the list. But first up, we do have Hannah Rose. And I know a lot of people talk about Hannah as being a pretty bad player and someone who probably shouldn't have been on the show considering she had just quit smoking. And yeah, it's pretty bad that she does quit the game, but at the same time, she wasn't going to be the first boot. She was at least going to be safe for that first tribal. And yes, while it is like kind of lame that she quits the game and probably shouldn't have played to begin with, I feel like the fact that she was at least going to survive the first tribal was enough to leave her off the list for me. Next up, we have Brandon Donlin, who is another player that people like to clown on for saying that he shouldn't have been on the show due to him being very bad at challenges and him having panic attacks on the island. And I mean, those things were at least a consideration, but again, I don't think Brand's the worst player in the world. And yeah, while he struggled a lot on the island, I think he at least had some skills for the game. He seemed to be pretty well liked on the Lulu tribe. He was also someone who got pretty unlucky by Hannah quitting the game, like losing one of his allies right off the bat. And I think had he not been on a tribe as bad at challenges as Lulu, he probably would have been in it for a bit and probably could have gained some traction in the game. But due to Lulu being so bad at challenges and really needing challenge strength, it really did cause him to be as early boot as he was. But I still think he has enough skills for the game to where he didn't make the list for me. Next up, we have Sean Edwards, another player that people like to clown on, and people like Jeff were very annoyed by for quitting the game. And obviously, it is a knock that he ends up quitting the game in a spot to where he wasn't going home in the tribal where he does quit the game, and him having this misread over him assuming that he was going to be the boot when he wasn't. But again, he was at least part of the initial majority on the Lulu tribe, and up until the Sabaya boot, he was at least in the majority group. And I think had Lulu not crumbled and lost so many challenges, he probably could have made it to the merge. And I think had he not gotten as bad of a swap as he did, that he probably could have reintegrated. So yeah, while he does have a pretty bad exit from the game, I think there were enough merits to his game outside that to where he didn't make the list for me. Next up, we have Jake O'Kane from 45, who does make it all the way to Final 3, but ends up playing one of the worst runner-up games in Survivor history, where he's pretty much on the bottom the entire season, constantly on the outs, and could have been some danger had he gone to more tribals in the pre-merge, and even after the merge is constantly a secondary target despite him being a non-threat, and just constantly fails at everything he tries to do. And obviously that's all very bad. And I did rag on him quite a bit in the 45 player ranking and in the runner-up ranking even. But again, he did at least make it to the final 3, which is something worth mentioning. And even beyond that, I think he's someone who at least recognizes the strategy of the game. I think he's someone who knows the game pretty well and knows what he should be doing. The problem is that he is just completely ineffective at getting anything he wants done. And I think he's someone who very rarely wins a jury vote as well, where while people seem to like Jake a lot, I think he comes off in a way that very rarely garners respect from people. So I do think those things are all pretty big issues, but it's at least the fact that he got to the end on his original season, and the fact that he at least knows the game was enough to keep him off the list. But I still think Jake is a pretty bad runner-up in Survivor history. Next, we're moving on to Survivor 46, and this may be controversial, but I did not include Jelinski on the list. Now, yes, Jelinski is probably a pretty bad first boot in the sense that he was included in the majority alliance, only to later be kicked out. And I do think Jelinski did do quite a bit wrong to cause his boot. But I think for me, the major reason why Jelinski doesn't make the list is I think he got a pretty bad landing spot on his season where he ended up on a tribe like Yanu, a tribe that was not only pretty bad challenges, but also was a tribe that didn't really connect with his gameplay style, where I think if we are looking at the things that Jelinski does, I think had he been on a different cast, a cast that was probably more game body or a cast that was more superfan heavy, that Jelinski probably could have gotten away with some of the stuff that he did, like quitting the Sweat and Savage challenges early as he did. I feel like that's a move that he probably recognized was a negative for his game, where had he wasted all these hours on the Sweat challenge, that he was not spending time bonding with the people back at camp. And I think his move of trying to quit that was at least somewhat based in reason, even though it does backfire. And the same thing with a lot of the other stuff that he does. I do think Jelinski is someone who probably would have done better had he been given like a more game heavy cast. But I think with this cast, like not really gelling with his gameplay style, that really caused him to be annoyed by the stuff that he was doing. But I think the fact that he at least has some potential to do well on a different cast was enough to leave him off the list for me. Next up, we have Jess Chong, the second boot of the season, and I think Jess was closer to making the list in my eyes, and I did very much consider it, though I think she is pretty similar to the likes of Brandon Donlin, someone who very much struggled on the island, and you could clearly tell that she was not dealing well with the conditions there. And she does at least try to make some moves. Like she does try to throw Kenzie under the bus at the second tribal, which is at least something worth mentioning. Not to mention she does at least survive the first tribal over Jelinski. But obviously, I still think Jess is someone who probably isn't suited to play Survivor. I feel like she's someone who probably would be an early boot more often than not. But I think there is at least enough merit to her gain to where she didn't quite make the list for me. Next up, we have Jem, also from 46. And I think Jem is someone who definitely played a bit too hard with her trying so hard to target Tin Spicer. And she did cook a bit too much with her whole Beware Advantage scheme that really blew up in her face. Mind you, I feel like it didn't quite blow up in the way you would expect, where you would think that you would be caught, like having found the Beware Advantage and trying to hide it from everyone, and that would cause people to be sus of her. When in reality, it more so blew up because her planting the seed of Tim having the Beware Advantage gave him implicit immunity that caused the choice to be between her and Ben, which is obviously unlikely to work in her favor there. So I do think she got a bit unfortunate by how her scheme worked out, and again, it is a situation where I think she caused her own boot, but not quite in the way you would expect. But again, I feel like she didn't play quite actively bad enough to make the list for me. Next up from 47, the only person I considered who did not make the list ended up being John Lovett, the first boot of the season. And again, John is someone who I think is probably an early boot most times he plays, where I feel like he's someone who didn't really have much of a shot coming into it, with him coming off a bit awkward and him being a bit more of a public figure there. So again, I did kind of consider it, but at the end of the day, I feel like John didn't do quite actively bad enough to make the list, even though I still think he'd be an early boot in most situations. And the final honorable mention to get into here is Stephanie, the first boot of 48. And straight up, I don't think Stephanie is the worst player in the world. Yes, while she was on the outs right from the start and didn't really have much of a shot of staying once her tribe went to tribal, I feel like she didn't do that actively bad to be the boot there. Plus, she did at least have Mary by her side. Also could have had Kevin potentially. And yes, while you could knock her for not getting Kevin to do something that was in his best interest and keeping her around, I think the fact that she at least had numbers by her side was enough to keep her off the list for me. And with that, we are finally at the top 10. And I did find this list here to be pretty interesting. It wasn't exactly the list or the ordering that I was anticipating coming into it, but here we are. But starting off at number 10, we actually have someone who was on the original list. However, they are now significantly lower than what they were before, not only in terms of their placement on the list from last time, but even within the order of the people that remain on the list here. By number 10, we do have Josh from Survivor 44, and I still think Josh is a pretty bad player when you really look at it. He's someone who should have been in the majority group, considering he was one of the more physical guys on his tribe, but despite that, he just fails to connect with most people there simply because of how reserved he was. And while I could say that some of that was due to him lying about his profession, where he didn't want to tell people that he was a doctor, which in turn made it so that he wasn't as open with people as he probably could have been, I think a lot of it is also due to him not having the most awareness in the world, where he even talked during the season about how he thought he was in the middle of the tribe when in fact he was on the bottom. So I do think Josh is someone who, again, considering his archetype, should have been in a better spot, but simply wasn't. And again, I think all those things are pretty bad, and he is eventually taken out at the merge in a spot to where he would have been voted out at the previous tribal had the Matthew quit not happened, and was eventually taken out at the first round after the merge. So again, it is a pretty bad game. However, I think a major reason why he is not as bad as other people is he does at least survive a tribal genuinely. He does survive the Claire tribal all right. And yes, while a lot of that's due to his physical strength, I mean, we're going to be talking about other people on the list that never really survived a tribal in the season, or at least not survive a tribal without some wacky circumstances. And then on top of that, you also have him surviving a second tribal, that being the Sarah Wade tribal, where yes, he was given an idol that gave him implicit immunity for that round, but he was also able to pull in Carolyn for that one round to take out Sarah. So again, there are at least some pros to Josh's game, and was definitely not to have him much lower on the list than what he was before, but I still think he's a pretty bad player and someone who I think would do bad in most appearances. But I think it's those pros that leave him all the way on the bottom here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have another person who was also on the original list and is also now much lower than what they were before. And here we have Brad from Survivor 41. And similar to Josh, I think Brad is also a pretty bad player, someone who definitely was a very erratic presence on the original Uwa tribe, someone who probably should have been the first boot off Uwa, but was eventually able to have the vote flip to Sarah at the last moment, which I don't really give Brad that much credit for. But I think Brad is someone who, similar to Josh, is someone that I still don't think has much potential in the game. I think Brad is just such a loose cannon that he'll eventually make himself a target regardless. But again, he does at least survive a tribal genuinely. And even beyond that, he's at least physical enough to where he won't be an immediate target right off the bat. And he also was shown to find advantages where he's able to get a vote steal and the beware advantage. I think those things were just enough to keep him not too much higher on the list for me, but he's still a pretty bad player, which is why he's here number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have yet another person who was on the original list. And while they have moved up slightly compared to last time, I still don't think they're the worst of the worst. And here we have Eric Abraham, the first boot of Survivor 41. And I still think Eric is someone that doesn't really have too much potential in the game. I think Abraham is someone who is probably going to be an early boot more often than not. Though I think something to consider here is I do think he got a pretty bad landing spot on the Yasi tribe where you had players like Liana and Evie that were not going to put up with his style of gameplay. And through that, he became such an instant target right at the bat. So I do think he got a bit of a bad landing spot. I think had he been on Luvu or Ua that he would have had a bit more natural allies in the game. But I think as is, he doesn't play the first round particularly well, where he is someone that is a consensus target right at the bat. He is voted out unanimously at that first round in a spot where he didn't even see it coming. So I do feel like Abraham is someone that doesn't play particularly well across the season and not someone who I look at particularly highly as a player. But I think compared to the people we're about to be talking about, I don't think he's as actively bad compared to those people. And I think with the fact that he at least got a bad starting tribe, it was enough to have him at least this low on the list where he's here number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we're finally talking about someone new who was not on the original list and will comprise the majority of this list moving forward to where there's actually only one other person that was on the original list to still be talked about here. But number 7, we have someone who is probably more in line with the likes of Abraham and someone who didn't play as actively bad as certain other people, but also someone who just had a pretty bad run their season. And here we have Sifu from Survivor 45. Now again, I don't think Sifu plays as actively bad as certain other people we're about to be talking about, and I feel like Sifu doesn't do as much to actively turn people away from him or do as much to blow up his game, but at the same time, he's also someone who is pretty much on the bottom for his entire run, and someone who, despite getting all the way to 12th place, he's second round after the merge, he's also someone who was pretty much on the bottom for the entire season, and someone who didn't really have anyone in the game by his side, and is someone who would have been voted out at most opportunities had he not been immune, where he is on the bottom of the original Reapas and would have been voted out under most situations, but they end up winning their way to the swap. He didn't get to the swap where he is stuck with most of his original tribe, but they do have Sean Edwards, who should have been like this easy target for them had they gone to tribal, but despite this, we get to the one tribal he attends before the merge, where his entire tribe flips against him, where they were planning to keep Sean in the game over Sifu, and he only gets saved by the fact that Sean quits the game, so I don't really give him much credit there. And then he wins his way to the merge, where at the mergatory he is on the winning team, so he's immune there. And then we get to the split tribal, where he is just a consensus target there. Now he does get a bit unlucky by the fact that Bruce is on his team, who had an idol that made it even less lucky for the vote to flip against Bruce there. But I still think Sifu is someone who, despite getting to 12th place, never really survives a genuine tribal in the season, where the one tribal he attended before the merge is one where he was going to be voted out until Sean quit the game, and then he's essentially voted out at the next opportunity. So I don't really find Sifu's game that impressive, and the fact that he just fails to build any real connections on his tribe, never really has any real traction in the game, is a major knock against him for me, and obviously a reason why he does crack into this list. Though at the same time, I feel like he doesn't play as actively bad as other players we're about to be talking about, where really his biggest issue is just the fact that he doesn't connect with anyone in this group, and it's just on the bottom the entire time. But I think considering just how bad of a run he has across the season, I can't really justify leaving him off the list. So it's for that reason that he's here, number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have another new player to be talking about, and one that I really debated on, as I really consider whether this person should have even been on the list, as I do think this person has higher highs than people we already talked about, but at the same time, the lows are really hard to ignore. But number 6, we do have Rome from Survivor 47. And I really debated on Rome, as you can definitely argue that he shouldn't even be on the list, as he at least had Genevieve by his side, and he also demonstrated the ability to find advantages, where he was able to find an idol right at the bat, and then was able to get a vote steal for the very next round, which is all pretty good there. And he does survive two tribals before his eventual boot, so again, those things are positives. But I think if we look at his game outside of that, I think he demonstrates some really terrible social play where while he does build a connection with Genevieve and Genevieve is willing to work with him for those first few rounds, he pretty much isolates the rest of his tribe where he obviously treats Asia and Saul pretty poorly to where they want nothing to do with them and he's just actively mean to them for no real reason. So obviously that's pretty bad. Even Kashan and Teeny are people that he didn't treat particularly well and they were more so just using him as a smokescreen for those first few rounds. Or even see that Kashan is trying to flip the vote against him at the second round, and it's more so due to Rome finding out that causes him to use a vote steal there. And while Rome does survive those first two tribals, I think it is almost entirely due to the fact that he has these advantages. Where I feel like he would have been a pretty consensus target at both these rounds had he not had some sort of advantage to give him implicit immunity, where obviously he was going to be safe for that first round where he had that idol there, and then even with the second round, like him having that vote steal made it very difficult for them to actually flip the game, where Kashan was essentially banking on Rome misplaying the vote steal in order to get him out when he was trying to plan that. And in general, I feel like Rome is someone who really relied solely on these advantages to get through those first few rounds. Where even Genevieve, while he did build that bond with Genevieve, I very much question whether Genevieve would have stuck her neck out for him had he not had these advantages that would have kept him safe there. And you can question whether Genevieve was just using Rome to get through these rounds, considering that he had these advantages to keep him safe there. So I do feel like Rome is someone who really demonstrates some poor social play there. And then we get to the mergatory round where he also plays that pretty poorly, where you have him trying to throw Kyle under the bus in a spot to where Kyle want to work with him, which obviously makes him an even bigger target. And by the end, he is his consensus target, where he's voted out near unanimously at that first round. And I do feel like Rome is someone that demonstrates a lot of pretty bad social play across the pre-merge there. And despite him surviving these rounds, I don't really find it too impressive that he survives these first two tribals outside the notion of the fact that he's able to find these advantages to begin with. So I do feel like Rome is someone who probably does pretty poorly on most appearances. The reason he's not higher though is, again, he does at least have the ability to find advantages, and you can kind of credit him for having that bond with Genevieve that basically allowed him to be in the majority for those first few rounds. But outside that, I think Rome is a pretty bad player, which is why he's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and sort of similar to Rome, I feel like this person has at least one major pro for their game, but I always knew this person was going to make this list. I always knew that this person was going to make the list after watching their season. But number 5, we do have Bruce from Survivor 44 and 45. And Bruce is someone who obviously makes it the deepest out of anyone on this list, where he gets all the way to the final 8, which I think is at least something worth mentioning. And on top of that, I think the major pro for Bruce is his challenge ability, where I think something to consider is the fact that he does win quite a bit of challenges on the season, where he obviously wins his way to the merge, like winning every pre-merge challenge. He's someone who is obviously safe during the mergatory round, and he also wins 2 individual immunities post-merge in a row, which is all pretty good there. And beyond that, he is able to find an idol. So I do think those things are at least worth mentioning here, and definitely a reason to consider Bruce is someone that probably should be lower on the list, if on the list at all. However, I think when we really look at his 45 run, he should have been set for that season. He is someone who really had this massive advantage coming into the season as someone who was on 44, someone that people got to know from 44, and someone that people really wanted to work with. I mean, there were so many people coming into 45 that talked about wanting to work with Bruce, who felt bad for him considering that he was medevac so early from 44, and someone who seemed like a pretty affable person to where people wanted to work with him. And then he proceeds to blow it, where he goes on 45 and ends up annoying the majority of his tribe, where obviously Couture hates him right the bat, but then even the rest of his tribe just gets fed up with his dad energy and really want nothing to do with him moving forward, where he ends up going for someone that most of the people on the season want to work with to a pretty consensus target, where despite his tribe winning their way to the merge, is someone who probably would have been voted out at most opportunities had they ever gone the tribal in the pre-merge. He obviously wins the Mergatory Challenge, so he ends up being safe there. And then we get to the split tribal, the one tribal before the final 8 where he is not immune. And while he does genuinely survive that vote, which is something I will give him, It's also in a spot to where he had an idol, and there was also Sifu there as his easy alternative, so it made it so that people didn't really want to bother trying to blindside Bruce when they could have just taken out Sifu instead. So I don't really give him that much credit for surviving that round. And then beyond that, he proceeds to win the next two immunities in a row to where he would have been voted out both times had he not won those immunities. And at the same time, his alliance is crumbling, where he's not even in the majority alliance and doesn't really have anyone in the game by his side. So he's just kind of winning these challenges on his own. And then we get to the final eight, the only other round in the game outside the split tribal where he's not immune. And he ends up getting tricked by Emily into not using his idol, where he knew coming to that round that he was going to be like this pretty big target, considering he was already a target for previous rounds and is also someone who had just won these last two immunities. And yet he still somehow doesn't play the idol there, which is pretty insane there. Not to mention the fact that it wasn't even in Emily's best interest to blindside him at that point, where he was this pretty easy goat and someone who was never going to win a jury vote at the end. Now, I think even with the run that he had, you can still debate whether he should be in the top 10, as again, he still made it to 8th place and he did demonstrate the ability to win challenges. So I do think those things are worth considering, but I think it's the fact that, one, even with him getting 8th place, he was still voted out at the second opportunity where he was just immune for most of his runs. So I feel like that doesn't really hold much weight for me. But I think on top of that, it's just the fact that this was his best case scenario. He had such a big advantage coming into the season with his background of having been on 44. And yet, despite him having this massive advantage, he still had the run that he did on the season, which in turn makes me think that he'll just be bad on every single appearance and that most other appearances will probably be worse than this. So I feel like it's for that reason that despite this ability to win challenges and despite his longevity on the season, I still think Bruce is a really terrible player, and that's a big reason why he's here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have another player who I did debate on their exact placement on this list. However, after thinking about it, I did decide to go with TK here from Survivor 47. And TK is someone who I think is pretty similar to the likes of Josh from 44, in the sense that he's someone who probably should have been in a much better position than what he really was, where he was one of the more physical people on his tribe and should have been at least in the majority on his starting tribe, or at the very least not been an initial target. And yet he is a target, where he is the first one voted out of his tribe, which is pretty bad there. He's also someone that really demonstrates some poor social play along the way, where while he has his plan of creating this alliance with Kyle and Tiana to force a tie, he really does nothing to manage his relationship with Tiana. He doesn't even bother to have many conversations with her. Instead relies solely on Kyle to do a lot of legwork for them, where he really doesn't even bother to build a relationship with Tiana in a spot to where he was trying to actively pull her into his alliance. And on top of that, you also have the whole immunity challenge debacle, where he ends up calling out the slackers in the challenge and Tiana taking offense to that. And yes, while he didn't intend to call out Tiana in that spot, I think the fact that Tiana took it against him really speaks even further to their lack of a relationship. So I do feel like by the end, TK really does it to himself and really pushes Tiana away to the point where Tiana votes him out, despite not even being in her best interest to do so. So I do feel like there's a lot of bad there. And the fact that he is the first voted out, despite him being this big physical guy, is a pretty bad knock there. Though I think there are a few redeeming qualities that keep TK from being even higher in this list. One is the fact that he at least had an ally in Kyle by his side, and while he was always on the bottom of the tribe, the fact that he had Kyle by his side is at least something worth mentioning. And on top of that, I do think there is a little bit of wonkiness in the reason why he was targeted, where supposedly it was because Sue simply didn't like him right at the bat. And I'm not entirely sure how much to fault TK for this, where I'm not sure how much of it is due to pregame notions that Sue had against TK, and how much of it was TK pushing her away. But regardless, it did seem like Sue just had it out for TK from the beginning, so that is a little bit of grace I'm willing to give TK here, but at the end of the day, I still feel like he's a pretty bad player, really demonstrates some poor play across his round, really does a lot of his boot to himself, and is someone that shouldn't have been in this spot to begin with. But I feel like it's for those reasons that I do have him here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this is a player who I always knew was going to be on the list. However, the order of their placement here was definitely up for debate here, as I do think this person has a few merits to their game and definitely some considerations for them being lower or possibly not even on the list. But similar to the likes of Roman Bruce, I feel like their negatives are so massive and just so difficult to ignore that at number 3, I did decide to go with Banu. And to me, Banu reminds me a lot of Genie from 41, who I did have very high on my original list, but obviously he's someone who I kicked off the list. And a lot of that was because I did give Jeannie at least a little bit of credit for getting all the way to the final three of the Uwa tribe. And while she was on the bottom the whole time, and while she's someone who definitely demonstrates some poor play there, I did think that Jeannie's longevity on the tribe and the fact that she just happened to be on a disaster tribe like Uwa was at least enough of a consideration to leave her off the list here. And I do think Banu is kind of in a similar boat where he is also on a disaster tribe. He's also someone that at least survives the first two tribals, getting through the Jelinski and Jess rounds, and voting in the majority both times, which I think is at least something to point out here. And is someone who, at least at one point, was considered to be pulled into alliances where you had people like Q that was willing to coach him up, and even the likes of Kenzie, like, didn't completely hate him to where she at least was willing to vote out Jess before Banu. So I do think that's something to consider. That and also he did seem to be good enough in challenges to where he wasn't an immediate priority to be taken out. So I do think there are at least a few merits to Banu's game, but sort of similar to Genie, I think Banu is someone that just isn't fit to play Survivor. And this is sort of different from what I said earlier with the likes of Hannah Rose or Brandon Donlin, who I also said were unfit to play the game, largely due to health reasons and them just not dealing well with the conditions. I think Banu is someone who definitely can put up with the conditions, but is also someone that just doesn't understand the game on any real level. And I feel like he really just blows Genie out of the water when it comes to just how actively bad of a player he is. Where it's sort of funny that he talks about how he is a super fan, how Survivor's been his dream for years and years, but yet he just comes onto the show and just seemingly doesn't understand that it's a game and that people will be deceiving you at opportunities. And I feel like Banu just completely misses the boat in that regard, and someone who just blows opportunity after opportunity, where you have Q being willing to work with him and willing to coach him through the game, but just completely refusing to go along with it. And it gets to the point where everyone just pushes him away, doesn't want to work with him. He goes on the journey in a spot to where he knows that he's going to be the next consensus target off his tribe. But despite this, he doesn't even want to do the challenge, where he says that he would rather use a shot in the dark than do this challenge that would have given him this advantage, as he was worried that he was going to risk his vote and that he would rather have a shot in the dark than actually try to complete the challenge. And obviously, while he does go through with it, I do think that shows like a lack of foresight there. And beyond that, he is someone who I think just sees Survivor as like this survival and adventure style of show versus an actual game than anything else. And then by the time he is booted in the fourth round, it's such an open and shut case to where people aren't even willing to pretend that they're willing to work with him, where they're just telling him to his face that he's going home. And yes, while a lot of that's because he didn't have a vote and there really was nothing he could do to prevent it, I do think it also speaks to the fact that he was just unable to build any inroads. He was just unable to really build any connections and just didn't understand the game on any level. He also talks about how lying is not in his nature and he just spills information left and right, just admitting to people that he doesn't trust them. So again, I feel like Banu is someone that is just not fit to play the game. I think he's someone who doesn't understand the social strategy elements of the game. And I think he's someone who I would never expect to do well on any season. And I think the fact that he does blow opportunity after opportunity really elevates him above the likes of a Genie, who, as I said in my previous video, I think is someone who is just way too passive in the game. I think Banu's issue is not that he's passive, he's just actively bad at the game. And I think for me, that is worse than someone like Genie, who was in a similar spot to Banu during a lot of the game here. So I feel like for a lot of those reasons, I do consider Banu one of the worst players of the new era. And it really is hard to justify him not being on this list when we just see just how bad of a game he plays. But again, I did have some reservations with the fact that he does at least survive the first two tribals. The fact that he is at least competent in challenges to where he is not necessarily the earliest boot off the bat and is someone who I think can have opportunities at times. But I think through his stint on the season, I just have no faith in him to actually act on any of those opportunities and to not blow up his game at every opportunity. So it's for those reasons that despite Banu surviving tribals along the way, I still think he is one of the worst players of the new era, and that's why he is here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and for me this was an interesting debate between these top two, as I feel like these two are bad for completely different reasons. Where one of these players is probably more actively bad and made more actively bad decisions across their season, even though they did survive a tribal before their eventual boot. while the other person is someone who never survived a tribal and probably never would have survived a tribal despite them getting all the way to the merge. And again, I did have a debate over which one was worse in my eyes, but I did decide to go with more actively bad gameplay as being worse than just being on the bottom the entire time. So with that, at number 2, I did decide to go with Charity from Survivor 48, who is the most recent player on this list here. And as I described a moment ago, Charity is someone who was on the bottom the entire time, despite her getting to Mergatory, and only gets to Mergatory due to her tribe winning every single challenge in the pre-merge, to where had she ever gone to tribal in the pre-merge, she is a goner on both her original Siva tribe and even on her swapped Logi tribe, which is pretty bad there. And in many ways reminds me a lot of some of these first boots, these people that never really survive a tribal, including Sifu, who I talked about earlier in this video. But I think what separates Charity from the likes of Sifu is that we literally get to see her being on the bottom of not one, but 2 different tribe configurations. Where unlike Sifu, who essentially spends the entire season with his original reboot group, we get to see Charity getting swapped into a completely different tribe configuration, where on her swapped Logi tribe, there's only one other person from her original tribe on there, that being David, whereas the other 4 people are people she had never met before. And yet, despite that, she is still on the bottom of that group, where you had the likes of Eva calling her fake and people never really trusting her, and even like David throwing her under the bus, despite her thinking that David was in her back pocket. I do think that is pretty bad on its own. And then, like I said earlier, she was also on the bottom of the original Siva tribe, where the only person she even is able to build a bond with is Mitch. And even by the time of the merge, we don't really see Mitch doing much to save her, where we get to the mergatory vote where she is voted out essentially unanimously, where while they do decide to split the vote, everyone knew that she was going home in that spot, including Mitch, who was her one ally in the game. And despite that, Mitch does almost nothing to try to save her and was just fine letting her go in that spot. So I really think Charity does play this really bad game, and in my eyes is very similar to these first boots that we talked about earlier, and is similar to Sifu, who also never survives a single tribal. But I think what makes Charity even worse is that she had more time in the game to potentially find her footing, where at least with some of these first boots, you could argue that had they had more time in the game, that they could have potentially flipped things around. I don't think Charity was ever able to do that, where despite her being able to be on this tribe for days and days, she was just unable to make any progress in building connections there. And even after the swap, was still unable to make any connections. And by the time she went home, she really had no one fighting for her. And I feel like with her not really having any pros beyond this, where at least the likes of Rome and Bruce have either like a good challenge ability or the ability to find idols, Charity really doesn't even have that. So I feel like it's for those reasons that I think Charity is probably one of the worst players in the new era, even with her placement at the merge. But again, I feel like her actual social play is not as actively bad as the number 1 person, which is why she's here at number 2. And now at number 1, the worst player of the new era is actually the one remaining person who was on my original list, and they were actually number 2 on my original list, but after some reassessment, they have moved up to number 1. By number 1, we have Geo from Survivor 43. And again, I think Geo played more actively bad than someone like Charity, where I feel like there are more points where you can say that Geo is a bad player, where despite him being on the bottom for pretty much his entire run, which is similar to that of the rest of this list, he doesn't even seem aware of the fact that he's on the bottom, where he thinks that he, Ryan, and Carla are in the middle of everything. And even up until his boot round, he still thinks he's part of the majority group, when in reality, he is always on the bottom the entire time. Now, yes, he is able to build a connection with Ryan. He does genuinely have Ryan by his side, but he also thinks that he has Carla in his corner, when Carla clearly was working more so with the Lindsay and James side than anything else. And Geo is someone who was about to be voted out at the first tribal until Lindsay had her blow up, which again has nothing to do with what Geo did. And then we get to his next round where he is the consensus target there. But yet despite this, he and Ryan decide to throw the immunity challenge, where he thought that by throwing the challenge that he'd had this clear opening to blindside Cassidy, not even realizing the fact that he was going to be the target instead, which is pretty bad. But yet despite this, Geo and Ryan are just so full of themselves after they pull out this plan and think that they're about to get a 1-up on Cassidy. And on top of that, you have Geo going on the journey where he ends up getting a knowledge of power, which is at least something to point out here. But then he proceeds to tell Carla about it in a spot to where he had just seen 41 and 42, where it was obviously a major mistake to tell people about the knowledge's power through Liana, and the fact that Gio is just so comfortable in his relationship with Carla to the point where he just tells Carla about it really sets it up so that he's eventually sniped out of the game at that next round. And again, I feel like Gio does a lot pretty bad. And again, as someone sort of similar to the rest of the people on this list in the sense that he is on the bottom the entire time, is someone that doesn't really have many pros going for him, where he's obviously a challenge liability, and that's part of the reason why he was targeted in the first round to begin with. But I think it's mixing in the fact that he is someone that just didn't seem well aware about his position on the tribe, where at least a lot of the people on the rest of the list at least knew that they were facing some adversity there. But I think Gio just never fully got it. He seemed to genuinely think he was in the middle of the tribe the entire time. And I do think he does plenty of actively bad work that just further digs his grave, like throwing the challenge and telling Carl about the knowledge's power. I do think there's a lot of bad there. And I still have the same complaints that I had with Gio from the previous list. But now, considering the rest of the context of this list, he is also someone that I think is someone that I just don't have much faith in. I think he's someone who's probably going to be an early boot pretty much every single time that he plays. And I do think he does a lot bad to make that situation even worse. And I think even though he does survive a tribal, even though he did technically have an ally in Ryan by the time he went out, I do think he demonstrates enough poor play to where I can now say he is the worst player at the new era. So because of that, he is here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you liked this content, be sure to like and subscribe really helps out with the channel. Now I'll be making more videos like this as we are heading into the off season, so be on the lookout for that. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.